In 2007, a team of doctors in Berlin slid a 3,300-year-old sculpture into a hospital CT scanner, the same machine they normally use to find tumors and broken bones. They weren't looking for a secret, they were just trying to understand how the bust was made. But when the images came back, the lead researcher stared at the screen and said something that would change history. He said, "The sculpture has two faces." And the one underneath wasn't just a rough draft, it was a complete finished portrait, deliberately hidden, deliberately different, and deliberately more realistic than the face the entire world has been looking at for over 100 years. What happened next forced historians to ask a question nobody had ever considered before. Did the most famous face from ancient Egypt actually belong to a different woman? And if it did, why would someone go through all that trouble to hide the truth? You've seen this face before. Smooth skin, perfect symmetry, that elegant neck, that faint, knowing smile. It's been called the most beautiful face to survive from the ancient world. Millions of people have walked past it in Berlin's Neues Museum and seen exactly what the sculptor wanted them to see. Flawless, ageless, almost otherworldly. But that face you recognize, the one on every textbook cover and documentary, it might not actually be Nefertiti, or at least not the real one. Because underneath that perfect exterior, hidden for over 3,000 years, there's a second face. And that face tells a very different story. One that begins not with the queen herself, but with a discovery made by accident on a cold December morning in 1912. The date was December 6th. A German archaeologist named Ludwig Borchardt was digging through the ruins of an ancient Egyptian city called Amarna. This wasn't a royal tomb or a grand temple. It was an artist's workshop, the studio of a master sculptor named Thutmose. And inside, buried under sand and debris, Borchardt found something that made him forget how to breathe. It was the bust of Nefertiti, sitting exactly where it had been made 33 centuries earlier. Borchardt wrote in his diary that night that words could not properly describe it, that it was something you simply had to see with your own eyes to understand. But here's what he didn't know. The bust he was holding wasn't a single piece of art. It was two completely different portraits stacked on top of each other. And the one underneath, the one nobody could see, looked nothing like the famous face we all recognize. To understand why that matters, you need to know how this sculpture was built. Thutmose used a two-stage process. First, he carved a solid core out of limestone. That was the basic shape, the structure of the skull, the neck, the general placement of the features. Then, on top of that stone foundation, he applied layers of stucco, a plaster-like material that could be smoothed and refined in ways that raw limestone simply couldn't allow. That technique was common for high-status portraiture. It gave sculptors enormous creative control. Rough out the underlying structure in stone, then spend as much time as needed sculpting the outer layer, smoothing a line here, softening an edge there. It's a bit like a modern artist building an armature first, and then applying clay on top. Except in this case, the hidden internal layer wasn't just a rough support structure. It was already a complete, detailed portrait in its own right. Finished with the same care as the surface everyone was meant to see. But here's where it gets strange. When researchers compared the hidden face to the one everyone knows, they weren't just slightly different. They were deliberately different. And those differences weren't random. They told a very specific story. The hidden limestone face has faint creases at the corners of the mouth, subtle lines that suggest age or just natural expression. Those lines are completely gone on the outer face, smoothed away entirely by the stucco layer applied on top. The nose tells a similar story. Underneath, the limestone carving has a small bump along the bridge, a very natural human detail. On the surface everyone sees today, that bump is gone, replaced with a perfectly straight line that looks almost surgically refined. Even the cheekbones were adjusted, built up and reshaped on the outer layer to appear higher and sharper than what the stone underneath actually shows. The CT scans revealed something else, too. The stucco coating covering the limestone core isn't evenly applied. It's thicker in some spots and thinner in others, which tells researchers this wasn't just a simple uniform coat of plaster. The artist was actively reshaping specific features on purpose, one at a time, feature by feature. Dr. Alexander Huppertz, who led the scanning team, described it simply. He said the sculpture essentially has two slightly different faces, and that studying the layers gave researchers valuable insight into exactly how the piece was built over 3,000 years ago. But the question that kept everyone up at night wasn't about technique, it was about motive. Why would a master sculptor carve a realistic, detailed portrait first, and then deliberately cover it up with a second, more perfect version? One explanation is that this was just standard studio practice, an ordinary adjustment to match accepted beauty standards. Nothing more dramatic than that. But not everyone stops there. Since the scan results were published, some historians have floated a much bolder idea that the hidden limestone face might actually be closer to how Nefertiti truly looked as she aged, and that her natural features were quietly softened and idealized before being shown to the public. If that theory holds up, this bust might be one of the oldest known examples of a ruler's public image being deliberately managed and enhanced, thousands of years before anything like a modern photograph or magazine cover ever existed. Think about what that means. We live in an era obsessed with the idea that photographs and filters can quietly reshape how a person is remembered, and we tend to treat that as a distinctly modern anxiety, something unique to smartphones and social media. But 3,300 years ago, a royal sculptor working in a mud brick studio in the middle of the Egyptian desert was apparently doing something remarkably similar. The period Nefertiti lived through, known as the Amarna period, is actually famous among historians for moving toward more realism in art, not away from it. Compared to the rigid, formal art style Egypt had followed for centuries before, Amarna art feels surprisingly human. Royal family members are shown hugging each other, playing, showing affection, things you almost never see in earlier Egyptian royal art. Children are drawn with soft, rounded proportions that actually look like children. Akhenaten himself is famously depicted with an unusually long face and a narrow body, features that historians still argue about today. Some think it was deliberate artistic exaggeration tied to religious symbolism. Others think it might reflect something closer to his actual physical appearance. Either way, the entire artistic movement leaned towards showing real human detail instead of hiding it, which is exactly what makes the Nefertiti bust so unusual. The face on the outside is almost impossibly smooth and symmetrical, closer to an ideal than to any single real human face. But the hidden face underneath, with its small lines and subtle imperfections, feels much closer to the humanized artistic spirit that defined Amarna art in the first place. So here's the real mystery. If realism was the goal, why hide a more realistic face under a more idealized one? Some historians believe the answer is surprisingly cynical, that Tutmosis was essentially creating propaganda, carving one version that captured the queen's true appearance, then building a second, more politically useful version on top of it, one that projected power, beauty, and divine status, a version that would make viewers feel awe rather than recognition. But not everyone agrees with that dramatic reading. Other researchers argue the differences between the two faces, while genuinely interesting, might simply be too subtle to support a theory about political image control. In their view, the changes could just be the natural result of switching between two very different materials. Carving limestone and shaping stucco are not the same artistic process. Limestone naturally produces a textured, imperfect surface. Stucco lets an artist create smoother contours and softer transitions. So what looks like intentional image manipulation from one angle might just be the normal, expected finishing stage of a sculpture from another angle. Under this interpretation, Thutmose wasn't crafting propaganda at all. He was simply completing a piece of art the way any skilled sculptor of his era would. Either explanation you choose to believe, This discovery drags up a much bigger question that historians still can't fully answer. How much do we genuinely know about Nefertiti as an actual person? The honest answer is surprisingly little. There's no diary. No personal letters written in her own hand have ever turned up. No first-hand written account describing her personality, her daily life, or how she actually thought and felt survives anywhere. Almost everything we think we know about her comes filtered through images, statues, temple carvings, official royal artwork. And out of every single image that survives, none has shaped the modern world's idea of Nefertiti more than this one bust. For over 100 years, it has quietly defined how the entire world pictures her. But if the face on the outside really was intentionally refined and altered from the portrait carved underneath it, then the exact image that became her global identity might also be the version least faithful to how she truly looked. The journey the sculpture went on after it left the ground is almost as wild as the mystery hiding inside it. After arriving in Berlin in 1913, the bust actually stayed out of public view for years, held in private collections rather than displayed. It wasn't until 1924 that Berlin finally put it on public display, and the reaction was immediate. Crowds were captivated. Newspapers gushed over it. One publication at the time called it the most lifelike object ever recovered from ancient Egypt. But its story wasn't finished. When World War II brought heavy bombing campaigns across German cities, museums across the country had to move their most valuable pieces underground for safety. Nefertiti ended up hidden deep inside a salt mine in Thuringia for the rest of the war. After Germany's defeat, the bust became part of the collection based in West Berlin. Through the Cold War, it stayed on display in the Egyptian Museum on the western side of the divided city, while related artifacts sat separated in East Berlin behind the wall. It wasn't until German reunification that efforts began to bring the split collections back together. Today, the bust holds a place of honor inside Berlin's Neues Museum, in a room specifically designed and built around this one object. It's arguably the single most famous artifact in the entire country. And through every part of that journey, Egypt has never stopped asking for it back. In 2003, prominent Egyptologist Zahi Hawass formally requested that Germany return the bust, arguing the original transfer out of Egypt had never been handled properly. Germany said no. Hawass renewed the request in 2011. The answer stayed the same. So today, the bust sits in Berlin. Hundreds of thousands of visitors walk past it every single year, admiring that flawless, symmetrical exterior. Almost none of them realize there's a second face hiding right underneath it. A face that looks slightly older, slightly less perfect, and quite possibly a little closer to the real woman who actually lived more than 3,300 years ago. There's actually a third way to look at this whole mystery, one that skips past the whole argument between propaganda and honest imperfection altogether. Maybe the two faces were never meant to be seen as competing versions at all. Maybe they were just two different stages of a single ongoing piece of art. Under that reading, the limestone carving was simply the foundation, the structural starting point before Thutmose applied stucco to refine and finish the piece. The hidden face was never designed to be viewed on its own. It was a private, internal layer that existed only to support the public one built above it. If history had gone even slightly differently, nobody would have ever known that inner face even existed. And honestly, maybe it was never supposed to be found in the first place. But fate had other plans. First, a German archaeologist packed the piece into a shipping crate back in 1912. Then, decades later, a doctor in Berlin slid it into a hospital CT scanner and exposed something that had stayed invisible for over 3,000 years. What has actually changed since those scan results came out? We now know for certain that this sculpture isn't a single, simple object. It's a layered construction, a carefully carved limestone core wrapped in carefully applied stucco. We know a complete second portrait exists, hidden underneath the famous surface everyone recognizes. a fully realized face carrying deliberate, specific differences from the one on display. And we know that the sculptor intentionally reshaped particular features between that inner version and the outer one. That intentional choice might be the single most fascinating detail buried in this entire story. It turns a 3,000-year-old sculpture into something that feels startlingly modern, a reminder that the gap between how someone actually looks and how they choose to be seen by the world is not a new problem. It might be one of the oldest problems there is. It also changes how you should look at every other flawless statue, painting, or carved royal portrait you've ever seen from the ancient world. If a queen as heavily documented and as intensely studied as Nefertiti could carry a hidden, unrefined version of her own face for over 3,000 years without anyone knowing, how many other ancient portraits are quietly doing the exact same thing, sitting in museums right now, never having been scanned closely enough to reveal it? Most ancient sculptures have never been examined with anything close to the precision Huppertz and his team used on this one piece back in 2007, which means the Nefertiti bust might not be a rare exception at all. It might just be the first one we happen to catch. So let me ask you something. When you look at that famous face now, what do you actually see? Do you see the queen herself? Or do you see the image someone decided you should see? That's the real question buried under 3,300 years of sand and stucco. And honestly, the answer might say more about us than it does about her. Because the need to present a polished, perfected version of ourselves to the world, that's not uniquely ancient. That's not uniquely Egyptian. That's just human. And it's been true for a lot longer than any of us realized. If this video pulled you into something you'd never really thought about before, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing history explained this way, because there are plenty of hidden discoveries like this one still waiting to be uncovered. Drop a comment and tell me honestly, do you think the hidden face is the real Nefertiti? Or do you think this was simply how ancient sculptors normally finish their work? I genuinely want to hear which side you land on, because the answer might change how you see every ancient portrait from now on.